Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here today and to celebrate a really terrific event that Beth, Truesdale, and I have spent literally years and years working on overtime. And our plan for today is that we're going to each talk for a while, and then we've asked a bunch of people in the room who have a lot of experience to comment on both the topics of the book, but you don't have to have read the book. You can just comment as you see what the areas are. And we hope everybody will join in and we'll have a really good, fruitful discussion of overtime. And before I do that, I want to thank actually a list of people, because last time I did this, I suddenly went completely blank and sort of thought, oh, like who, where is the list? So I thought of all the things to write, the list is really important. So first of all, I want to thank everybody at the Pop Center for chipping in and really making this an enormous event, but most of all, Leslie Harkins, who's in the back there, who has been central to this from the very first step when we invited authors to till today, so it's terrific. Second, I'd really like to thank Oxford University Press for being, I would say, quite brave to publish a book that doesn't fall in any category that they have very neatly. It ended up being sort of in public health and medicine, which means it's not hitting all the social scientists and economists, but it's halfway between an academic book and a trade book. We had long talks with the authors about which way it would go, and everybody wanted a pretty academic book, but we wanted a book that like a normally smart person could read. So I hope it's that, but Oxford has been great. And Sarah Humphreyville has really been the primary editor and publisher through all of this, has been terrific, along with Emma Hodgkin. And I'd also like to thank Chad Zimmerman, who I don't know whether he's listening in or not. He was the editor before Sarah and responsible for our last set of books. But Oxford has really been quite remarkable in having a vision that it doesn't publish narrowly. It has published actually quite broadly and really been able to incorporate this. We're also going to thank Robert Wood Johnson, who is not responsible for the book at all, but whose ideas, I think, were really formative in our thinking about what creates good jobs, and we'll talk about that a lot today. And Paul Torini was our project officer at Robert Wood Johnson for an area in which they just were evolving on workplace well-being. And they were really terrific. And included in that team were Meg Lovejoy, who's here, who is our project director for it, and Erin Kelly, who's at MIT and in Berlin right now, Laura Kobzanski also, and the three of us and Meg really led it through. And we just thank Paul for a lot of the support that he gave. And finally, really last but most important, was Sloan Foundation. So Sloan Foundation supported not only the book, but 10 years of a project on working longer. And I want to start this by telling a little bit of the story of how the book evolved. And the book didn't start till, I think, the very last meeting that we had of this 10-year board of advisors. And at the end of it, during which time we had thought about nothing but retirement and how to get people to work longer. Like, could we go from 65 to 67? Could we go from 67 to 70? Like, suddenly, at the end of this whole meeting where we had done nothing but really focus on retirement and how to make Social Security solvent, a couple of people sort of looked at each other, and I totally remember, for any of you who know David Wise, sort of mumbled something kind of quiet and said, "What about all the people we're not counting?" I said, what? What about all the people we're not counting who aren't in employment statistics because they have dropped out of the labor market already? And nobody had a grasp of that. And after that, we went to a meeting at Stanford that they have every year that John Chauvin was leading at CEPR, which is the Institute for Economic Policy Research. And a lot of the authors that are in the book were all at this meeting, and many of them were also on this Sloan board. And in about an afternoon, I think we assembled the book with the idea that we needed to have people who would think about labor policy. We needed to have people who focused really on inequality per se, on people who looked at gender and geography, and all the things that weren't in a book on retirement. And that's really the beginning of the book. So our plan is Beth is going to kind of lay out the format of the book and really describe the problem, and then I'll come in and talk about some of the solutions that we've had and kind of where we think things are going. And then we really hope to open it to questions. And as I said, there are many people in the room who have a lot of expertise in this area and a lot of ideas about solutions and where we ought to be going. So we hope to hear from all of you, and then we will have wine and cheese, or not just cheese, but actually better than wine and cheese, more goodies. So Beth, I'll turn it over to you.
Super. So what I want to do is just to talk a little bit about building on some of the things that Lisa was saying, why we thought we needed this book, what we found out as we went through it, what things surprised us that we didn't know before we started. I think to start off with, it's no secret to say that population aging profoundly changes the future of work and retirement. I think that's well understood. Americans are living longer on average than they were 50 years ago. People who live longer are going to need income for more years of life. And so the question is, where should this money come from? Employer pensions and private savings are by and large not enough. Social insurance programs like Social Security are under strain from an aging population. And so working longer, delaying retirement has become a standard policy response. We might say the standard policy response to population aging. Not just in the US, but in most wealthy nations. Most wealthy nations have raised the state pension age. Here in the US, the Social Security so-called full retirement age is in the process of rising from 65 to 67, and some would like to see it at 70 or higher. The trouble is that, as Lisa described, is that the working longer proposition assumes that most people can delay retirement if only they are persuaded to do so. And there are some average trends, positive trends, that would make you think that this might be plausible for a lot of people. Not only are people living longer than they were 50 years ago, they are on average in better health than they were half a century ago. People on average have more education than they did. That might open up different job possibilities in later life. Work on average is less physically demanding than it was 50 years ago. But you hear me saying on average, on average, on average, right? Part of what we realized was that we needed to be looking at the inequalities as well as the averages. And we needed to be asking this question, who's left behind? What we found out in the process of doing this book is that delayed retirement is not feasible for everybody. And promoting longer working lives as the primary response to population aging leaves behind people who are going to struggle to maintain paid employment into their mid-60s or beyond. And there are many reasons for that, many of which are discussed in the book. Unstable employment, caregiving responsibilities for both older and younger generations, poor health, age discrimination, troubled local labor markets, and the effects of unexpected shocks like COVID or climate change. And we also wanted to talk about the ways in which retirement security is a systemic problem as well as an individual one. So there are parts in the book that talk about how during the past 4 decades we've seen rising economic inequality, diminished worker voice, Social Security funding in need of upgrading that it isn't getting, and an increased shift overall of economic risk from government and business onto families and individuals. So what this book aims to do really is to explore the problems that are facing us and some of the potential solutions. And I won't read this all out because you can look at the table of contents in the book yourself, but we have a lot of terrific chapters from a really interdisciplinary group of scholars. We've got epidemiologists, sociologists, economists, political scientists, psychologists, and industrial relations folks. It's been a really terrific interdisciplinary group, and I think that's been part of what's been really rich about these different disciplines, bringing their different perspectives and talking to each other. So I want to just pull out one story from one of the chapters. It's a story from the chapter by Mary Gatta and Jessica Horning. It's based on qualitative research with restaurant workers. And it's a story about a guy who they call Jim, who's a waiter in his late 50s from Pennsylvania. And in the book, Jim says, "Restaurant work, it's a young man's game. It's hard to keep up with the physical demands." In his 30s, Jim had a job where there were 2 steps from the dining room to the kitchen. And in order to go just that little bit faster when things were busy, he'd jump those 2 steps. And now, a couple of decades later, he has a chronic Achilles heel injury from all of that jumping. And he says, "I'm coming up on 60 years old. I don't know how much longer I can do my job. At my restaurant, everything is refillable. Bread, soda, soup, salad, pasta. It's like whack-a-mole. I just run my entire shift." That story suggests some of the reasons that people retire early. Another reason that comes through really clearly in the book is that a lot of jobs don't accommodate caregiving responsibilities. This graph shows the proportion of women, caregiving burden falls more heavily on women than on men, who are providing care to their parents or parents-in-law at some point in their 50s. And overall, the average is that about 1/3 of women at some point in their 50s provide intensive caregiving for parents or parents-in-law. And we're not talking about just like running errands for mom here. We're talking about help with daily tasks like eating and bathing and dressing that are hard to schedule around and hard to work jobs around. Unsurprisingly, this kind of caregiving cuts into women's labor force supply. Many other rich nations have various forms of paid leave that might help people to navigate some of these things. The US doesn't. One of the other things that's particularly interesting to me about the caregiving piece is that throughout the book we see inequalities where almost everything falls more heavily on the people who are least able to manage it. That is, the people who have the greatest disadvantages to start out with. In caregiving, as you see in the graph, the percentage of women who are caregivers is actually higher in the categories that are higher educated. That's because those are the women who are most likely to have living parents. The women who have less education are less likely to have living parents. This is a graph that I want to share with you because this has kind of been my go-to as we go through the book. What this shows you is these are employment rates from age 25 to age 70 for men on the left, women on the right, broken down by educational categories. College graduates on the top, high school graduates in the middle, people with less than a high school degree, the lower line. And there are 2 things about this graph that I always think are really remarkable. One is you can see so clearly how large the inequalities are between educational categories in terms of employment rates all the way across the life course. But the other thing you see is that gray band between ages 50 and 60. There's a drop in employment rates of about 20 percentage points for every demographic group that we looked at. And what I have come to think that means, how I've come to think about that is that while people with disadvantages of education, race, gender, and so on face greater difficulties in postponing retirement and working longer, this is a problem that is widespread. This is not only a problem for people who start out with disadvantages. Even people who start out with many advantages can't be guaranteed that they're going to be able to work longer. And for most people, too, it's worth saying that leaving the labor force early doesn't mean that they've made their fortune and they're off to enjoy a leisurely retirement. Leaving the labor force early just means having less to live on for the rest of their lives. So the other thing that I want to show you is this piece. When we changed from looking at just this sort of point in time snapshots of labor force participation to looking at employment stability all the way through somebody's 50s, we realized that only about half of older US adults were steadily employed all the way through their 50s, only about half. So if your mental model is like everybody works to 65 and then quits, that is not a mental model of retirement that works. Only about half are steadily employed through their 50s. And it matters, it's hugely consequential, because those who lack steady employment in their 50s are much less likely to be working in their 60s. In this graph, you can see that of people who were steadily employed all the way through their 50s, 80% of them were working in their early to mid 60s. Of people whose employment was more intermittent, only about a third of them were still working in their mid 60s. So I think I'm going to hand over here to Lisa to talk more about the kind of some of the policy conclusions that we started to draw as editors as we worked through the process of the book. But a couple of sort of overarching points that we came to. One is that demographic changes are inevitable, but policy responses to those demographic changes are a choice. That labor force policy is retirement policy and vice versa. So often these things are discussed as if they are separate, and they are not. Because fundamentally, and it's obvious the minute you say it, but fundamentally you can't delay retirement if you don't have a job to delay retiring from. That social inequalities in work and retirement are very large and persistent. But the problems are widespread, and the solutions need to be widespread too. And next, that policies to encourage delayed retirement need to address workers a decade or more before traditional retirement ages, much earlier in the life course. I'm going to hand over to Lisa.
Great. Okay, thanks. So Beth has really set the stage really well for what's the next part. And I want to say that we thought long and hard about whether we would have a chapter at the end on policy solutions, or whether we would just end, as most of us probably around the room, sit with as like, here's the problem. We can really describe the problem well. But like when it comes to thinking about the solutions, we're either not set. I mean, as an epidemiologist, I'm not a policy person. Policy people don't often go on a lot of the earlier data beforehand. And so often these two worlds don't intersect. But we did decide, excuse me, that we would do it. And we would take a stab at thinking about what are the policy implications of this for it. The chapter that we go through this in is the last chapter in the book. And what I want to say is that it's not a consensus of all the authors. That I would say all the authors agreed about the problems. Like if we had to vote chapter by chapter, we probably would have had like pretty close to 100% consensus on what each, on what was said in each chapter. When it comes time for the policy, excuse me, there's real divergence in opinions about what the solutions are. And I'll talk about some of them. So the work represents actually, I think, the two of us and our thinking about it. And Olenka, right, there she is, okay. Not actually everybody else. Although, as it turns out, most people are pretty happy with it. Like everybody read it, everybody could have voiced like a terrible response. They basically agreed that this was the chapter, but it's not a chapter of all the authors. So building on what Beth said, I think probably the fundamental, the shocker for us, which sounds obvious now, is kind of this mantra of labor policy is retirement policy, that you cannot think about retirement policy in the United States or probably any other country without thinking about what it takes to get people up to retirement. And that means going back decades earlier. And as you see, the 50s were kind of a critical decade, but people have to be enabled and be able to work, longer if you want them to work longer. And you can't hope to change this in people's 60s or looking at just an aging workforce. You have to really think about this as a problem that needs to be addressed much earlier, if not early in the occupational kind of ladder, at least, kind of middle age. The other lesson that I think we have is that there's enormous heterogeneity in people's both ability to work longer and in their opportunities to get jobs that will suit them and be jobs where people can work longer. And this heterogeneity means that perhaps like half the people in the United States, for instance, can work longer. And certainly if we raise retirement age, that will solve some of the Social Security problem. But probably half of the people won't be able to. And we need to think about what it takes to either give those people like secure financial security so that they can live without working as they get older, or we need to be able to redesign work so that they can live and work longer. And so I'm going to start with the idea of what it takes to create good jobs. And the creating part of the good jobs actually does build on a lot of the work that we've done in our Robert Wood Johnson thing, and a lot of it is related to the work that Erin Kelly and a collaboration that we have at MIT for a very long time. So creating good jobs is both a private and a public sector responsibility that I think anybody in the United States that thinks at this point that it's all a public sector responsibility is like dreamy, like wish that it were, but it isn't. So part of it rests with the private sector. And there are opportunities and there are people in businesses that actually have as a goal worker well-being, or at least see the connection between worker well-being and productivity. So what we concentrated on is what's classically called good jobs. We're going to build, I'll show you in a second, on a toolkit that Meg Lovejoy actually led, and it's part of our RWJ grant. But what we want to say is that we really believe that issues related to fair pay, to retirement benefits, health benefits, safe working environments in terms of physically safe environments are very basic. We're not like against that. We see that as kind of a bedrock of what we want to do. But what we also want to say is that it's not enough, that it doesn't get you there. It doesn't enable people to work longer in a safe environment where they're able to participate. And when we started to look at what the elements were, what the key elements were to working longer, that had to do with the workplace organization, we did a kind of very systematic review. We looked at things that were RCTs, we looked at the strongest evidence that we could, and we kind of came down to 3 areas. One of them is control at work. And we're going to talk a lot about schedule control, and Danny is here. Danny Schneider will comment later on schedule control as an important issue. But it has to do with autonomy and task variety, schedule control, employee influence over how they decide, and of course things like paid leave. So control over hours, predictability, both long and short work hours, turn out to be an incredibly important element in thinking about what good jobs are in terms of control. It isn't like you just get to control your workforce, or as an employee you get to come and go whenever you want. It isn't, a complete kind of control. Like when you see the examples, you'll see actually how marginal the examples are where increasing control has a health benefit and is good for employee health. The second element had to do with taming excessive work demands, and this has to do with reducing time pressure. It has to do with like just-in-time scheduling where people are called in rather unexpectedly or told they can't leave, or the rapid pace of work where actually the pace of having to move along, which is often in warehouses now, is really hard. The demands are very high. It's not only control, but just the sheer demands of either working at a rapid pace or even having 24/7 expectations. So many people who work in call centers or who are on email are kind of expected to be on call almost all the time. I mean, I actually call my son, his last response was, "Mom, I'm not on call," right? Like I'm not on call, whereas we think of businesses often as on call. And finally, the third element, which we call improving social relationships at work, I want to frame very broadly because a lot of the work I do on social networks is a much broader way of thinking about the structural way that people have relationships and recognizing the importance of that. I used to think in the early work on job demands and job strain, it was like supervisor support, as if like if your supervisor is just nice, like things will be better. Well, it is true. If your supervisor's nice, things will be better. It doesn't hurt, but it doesn't mean that social relationships are actually better. So I thought I'd give you a couple of examples of that. And this is from our work well-being toolkit, which is designed explicitly for employers. And it takes the best scientific evidence we have, and it gives examples, and it gives some case studies. So I'm going to show you two case studies. One is the just-in-time kind of control at work, job demand sort of issue. And it's a really well-known article. It was in the New York Times. It got a huge amount of press. Susan Lambert did a lot of this work from The Gap, where people were often told, or still are often told, they can't leave if the place is busy. Like they have to stay on or they lose their job. Or they shouldn't come in, which means they don't earn anything because it's a slow day. So many of these retail employers use just-in-time schedules like the one I described. And what they did was a randomized trial to improve schedule stability at Gap. And what they did was actually quite modest. Like when you read actually what they did, they just put people on more consistent shifts. So you knew your schedule ahead of time, which many people did not know. Like, so they were given a consistent schedule that was similar daily. They knew if they were going to get up at 5 or 8, that's when they could get it, that they had weekly start and end times. They also gave more adequate work hours for part-time people. So a lot of part-time people were basically doing an amount of work that they could not survive on. And it was very random when they were called up. And the other thing is that this is the structural part, is that they asked employees to give them input into scheduling through an app. So they created an app that enabled associates to swap shifts without manager involvement. And I would say this was one of the hugest things that they did that we also did in our work-family study. Like one of the things that we did in a nursing home study was enable people. I mean, the example that I give all the time is that there was a CNA whose wife lost her car keys and couldn't pick up her kids from school. And this is the kind of thing where we all run out, give the kid, swap the car keys, solve the problem, or pick up the kids, or whatever it is. And what he did, because he couldn't walk off the floor, and nursing homes have a very strict regulatory function where there have to be a certain number of people on the floor. You can't just walk off the floor to do this. He swapped 2 breaks with a friend of his. It took half an hour, right, to do this, like give the keys to the wife or get the car and come back and solve the problem. And that was part of the intervention, is that you could negotiate among your coworkers. And the idea was that overall there would be some equity, that if people were really abusing the system, sooner or later other people wouldn't swap with them to do it. So the Gap had a kind of app that was a better solution than that. And it resulted for sales associates in better sleep quality and less stress. And for the business, and this is the really interesting part, higher sales and labor productivity, and driven in large part by better retention of experienced employees. So I often think, and then everybody says, well, you might be really naive, which can be totally true, that sometimes what's good for worker well-being is good for the bottom line. That it can help with turnover, it can help with retention, it can help with productivity. It won't always be like that. If it were always be like that, then we wouldn't have had to have regulatory guidance for child labor or work hours or anything like that. So it's not a solution for any regulation at all, but sometimes it is. And I think that that can be quite compelling. So that's an example that's actually a real live example of what it's like to think about just in time. The second one is about social belonging. So this is the social relationship side, and I want to say that here there was a study of 9/11, 911 dispatchers looking at burnout and turnover, and emergency dispatchers, are in a really highly stressful job. And they're often pretty undervalued. They're answering, somebody screaming at them. It's often They have to assess whether it's a life-threatening condition or not, and then decide what to do. So what this intervention was, this is another example of a modest intervention, is that they did weekly emails from supervisors encouraging the sharing of stories about challenges and the value of 911 dispatcher work. And there was an online platform to share the stories. And one example that they gave is the story of a dispatcher who saved the life of a woman in a domestic violence situation by connecting her to the right support. This turned out to decrease burnout, enhance worker well-being, and organizational commitment. And for employers, resignations fell by half. So this is, again, a really good example of what's good for worker well-being. In this case, turned out to be really good for employers as well. So now I want to turn to the retirement piece, because clearly good jobs are critical, but they're not enough. If we didn't do anything else about retirement in the United States, we would have maybe fixed a really important part of the work side, but not the retirement side. And we need stronger retirement systems and disability insurance systems. Here is where I would say we had the most divergent kind of views about what the solutions are. And the evidence supporting any of these views is very slim. It's just like, here are some good ideas. That's what this amounts to. So one of the things that we really thought of as we started to look at Social Security is that Social Security solvency is a problem. However, there are many ways to fix it. One of the ways to fix it is that there's currently a cap of, I think, $147,000 of earnings, and beyond that, you're not taxed. So why wealthier people should not be taxed to continue to contribute to Social Security, where we are trying to get more disadvantaged poor people to work longer to earn it, is sort of like an anathema. Like, if solvency is the problem, is truly the problem, there are a number of solutions to this. And some of the estimates are that this kind of like raising the cap on taxation for contributions could solve up to 80% of the Social Security solvency problem. So clearly taxing the wealthy is not a very popular idea this time, but evidently I tried this out on a bunch of people at both the business school and who I would say are not all lefties. And they said there is a lot of bipartisan support for this, that this is not a crazy idea, that everybody recognizes that this is kind of an important area. So we shouldn't ask people to work longer to solve Social Security. If we want to solve Social Security, we should figure out how to solve Social Security. That's sort of number one. And if some people worked longer, like I think Gary Burtles in our Brookings event said really clearly, if half the people worked longer, or a quarter of the people worked longer, that would help. And that would be great. Like, we're not against that. What we're against is kind of not recognizing the heterogeneity that goes on, or the need for multiple approaches to shore up the problem. So the second one, which exists in many countries and has been talked about in this country and exists in some ways and in some unions and in some governmental agencies, is to create universal, automatic, and portable retirement savings plans. So currently, sometimes people contribute to savings plans within corporations, and if they leave that company, they lose their retirement savings. So having it be actually clear that it was portable, that it travels with you, given that people have multiple jobs, is also a really important thing. The other area is to develop early interventions to help injured or ill workers remain attached to the labor force. And this, along with the disability insurance, I would say is one of the thorniest problems. Like, people are quite torn about this. Like, some people think it creates perverse incentives, that if you give people the opportunity to work while they have an illness, they will never work as much as they could, so you have to be clear about it. Other people think, oh, it will actually enable people to be in the workforce longer. Like, you may not be able to, you think about long COVID, right? You may not be able to work 35 or 40 hours a week, but could you work 10 hours a week? Could you work 20 hours a week? Could we create a system that would enable people to stay attached so that as they work through this, they will stay in the labor force? Similarly, Social Security disability insurance is another area where we could minimize the insecurity and loss of work capacity that accompany very long delays. Exactly what we should do is very open. I would say it isn't got an absolute sort of clear answer. And update supplemental security income to raise federal disability benefits above the poverty level and ease restrictions for people is another area that we think is very promising and that we should think about. So just to really conclude this and wrap it up, and then we're going to open it up, is that retirement policy and labor force policy are really flip sides of the same coin. And that it kind of sounds really obvious once you think about it a little bit, but it is amazing how many people work in retirement and how many people work on good jobs and don't actually pull these two things together. The other thing is that social and economic inequalities put working longer in jeopardy for many, many people. We should not think that this is going to be a solution for really maybe half of America. It may be a good thing for 25%, or maybe it'll be good even for more than that, but it isn't going to be good for the people who, through their 50s, as Beth showed, are already struggling and not staying in the workforce. And robust retirement and disability policies are essential complements to working longer. Really important. We're not ignoring this side of it. And that idea that working longer policies have to be accompanied by good jobs. I think that that's really kind of the bottom line for us. And beyond that, I think you should read the book. And so we'll close it up and open it to a bunch of questions. I just really want to thank Beth because she's been, I've said, my better half through all of this, really carrying an enormous load of this set of chapters and getting it all done and moving it forward and everything. And it's been really terrific to be a co-editor with you and all the editors. So it's been really nice. So thank you. So that was it.